Welcome to our second week, where we will focus on media production. This avenue of research is ripe for interesting analysis about the producers and the content. Media ownership is really a tricky business, as a free media is an important concept that's hard to translate into reality. See, we know we don't want governments controlling the media because they may turn the news into propaganda. But organizations that own the media present an equally troubling opportunity for the creation of bias. The public has nearly always accused the media of bias. Research on news bias is really difficult to operationalize, and most of the empirical work comes from the assumption that the bias lies, at least in part, in the viewer. So that is to say that the accusation of bias is really a matter of perception. So if I'm a conservative watching MSNBC, then I'm likely to feel that their reporting is biased. Someone with a left-leaning approach will feel that the reporting is appropriately critical on MSNBC. This has to do with organizations. On page 75, your text quotes Upton Sinclair, who noted that when the news is owned by elites, we run the risk of taking the fair body of truth and selling it to the marketplace, who will betray the virgin hopes of mankind into the loathsome brothel of big business. Political economists explore this idea of ownership as the primary avenue for spreading an ideology that supports the status quo. Their empirical work centers around three areas of concern: internationalization, integration, and diversification. Internationalization. Technology in the post-industrial revolutionary world has allowed for the importance of national borders to lessen, as we can cross those borders physically and now electronically with ease. Corporations and corporate dollars also cross those borders, allowing certain media organizations and their ideology to cross those borders as well. A global environment of deregulation has allowed a concentration or a small group of companies to own a majority of the cultural objects distributed around our globe. Think about, for example, the influence of satellites, which allow for live events such as the World Cup or the Olympics to be displayed in real time across the globe. The political economists wonder if this internationalization, as a result of technology and deregulation, erases local cultures, either intentionally as hegemonic violence or unintentionally as the result of economies of scale. Programming on these big corporations tends to reflect global market trends rather than local media interests. The political economists argue that the Big Six, GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS, will produce a numerical diversity of channels, songs, artists, etc., but the source diversity of those things is rapidly lessening through mergers and takeovers by as much as 10 times in 50 years. This brings us to integration. As corporations have grown across national boundaries, they have also integrated with other aspects of the media production process to garner economic resources from a variety of ventures. Vertical integration is when an organization takes control of the steps, from production all the way to distribution, of a single media format, like film, for example. Horizontal integration is when a company is spread across media formats: television, film, print media, news, radio, internet, etc. What vertical integration allows is the corporation to profit from every stage of the production and distribution of the cultural object. Horizontal integration then allows the corporation to market the same cultural object in different mediums and to essentially make money from the same cultural object. Take, for example, the Finding Dory franchise. The film was released by Pixar Animation and distributed by Walt Disney Studios. This is a case of vertical integration, as both of those companies are owned by the Walt Disney Company. The soundtrack is released on Walt Disney Records, books are published on Walt Disney Publishing, shorts are shown on Disney Junior channels, Disney Interactive makes an online game for Dory, Disney Apparel makes Dory clothing, and the Disney parks have Dory rides. All of this gives the illusion that Dory is everywhere, an inescapable little blue fish. In actuality, this is an appearance of saturation that comes from a single source, which brings us to diversification. Diversification of the media refers to this numerical list of options that come from a very limited number of sources. If you look at Disney, it may look like a great deal of diversity in terms of the music labels, the television channels, but they're all owned by a single source. It's an empirical question how meaningfully different each of those cultural objects produced by each of those sub-labels is one from another. Some point out that smaller labels are only able to stay in business because they are owned by larger labels. Others suggest that this is merely an appearance of diversification with very little substance to it. It is worth noting that while few people question the concentration of media conglomerates today, the mechanism by which those organizations offer a limited ideology is really pretty debated. Some argue for a cudgel, which suggests that corporations are owned by elites who make conscious decisions to control the content and messaging with a purposeful agenda. This was the argument that some made about the inclusion of a minor character in the Frozen film. You may recall Oaken the traitor, and at one point he turns to his family and says, "Hi, family," and that family consists of another man. Some felt that Oaken was part of a larger liberal agenda to promote and normalize gay marriage. This approach theorizes a very involved elite who make clear decisions and set clear boundaries for their subsidiaries to abide by in regard to content and messaging. When you hear politicians and people rail against the mainstream media, they're often concerned about things like this: a cudgel approach to spreading ideology, which encourages us to think about an involved elite. The second argument is the conveyor, which suggests that elite organizations generate a culture that attracts a group of workers with shared values and backgrounds. Those workers, then, are the people who create cultural objects with a consistent ideology. In an attempt to parse out which of these is more empirically supported, researchers have begun to focus on organizational pressures and processes that influence media content. Your book covers several of these processes in depth, but I'd like to highlight three here: gatekeeping, advertising, and routines. Shoemaker argues that, simply put, gatekeeping is the process by which the billions of messages that are available in the world get cut down and transformed into the hundreds of messages that reach a given person on any given day. While an early form of this theory focused on individual gatekeepers, or one single person making a decision, modern theorists argue that there are actually hundreds, if not thousands, of gatekeepers whose job it is to parse down the world of information. These people most certainly exercise bias in regard to the everyday processes that inform their decisions. To the extent that the creators are either like-minded or alike in life experience, gender, race, class, education, etc., then they are likely to make choices about what content they think will be interesting and useful to their viewers. The key here is that if you have a bunch of people who are similar in meaningful life ways, their bias is going to be an inherent part of the media business, regardless of whether it's cudgel or conveyor. The second process is advertising. This is the pressure to sell advertising space, an essential component of the media industry, and it most certainly shapes what the content of the cultural object will be. Think about Rush Limbaugh. He lost a bunch of advertisers in 2013 when he called Georgetown law student Sandra Fluke a slut and a prostitute because she was advocating for reproductive care to be covered under health insurance. He had to think about and eventually stood by those comments, but the financial pressure by those advertisers certainly caused him to consider his comments. Advertisers are able to censor in this way, but they're also much more likely to pay for space in cultural objects that have a consumer base with a great deal of purchasing power. The third area is routines. Routines implies the importance of the process by which a cultural object is created. It's possible that there is bias embedded in those routines. So think about a news story getting printed, and you have to think about how much space is going to be above or below the fold. That kind of a routine may incorporate bias without intentionally creating bias. All of this is to say that the study of production process is an exciting area of research and full of rich empirical and theoretical debates. I have 2 hands-on projects for you this week that I hope that you'll enjoy. As always, shoot me an email or find me somehow on chat if you have any questions or you want to clarify what we've talked about here or the material in your text. Hope you guys have a great week.